Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to Mark Anthony's Music Picks. Today is episode number 137, and for today's episode, I'm going to be covering one of my favorite superstar, legendary status, up on a pedestal DJs, one of my favorites of all time from my clubbing, DJing, and music listening career. Today, we're going to talk about Danny Howells. Now, all the way back in episode 1, I talked about one of Danny's balance CDs, and it was actually a chance for me to kind of like open up, and it was one of the more personal episodes that I've done, and it's fun to look back on it now, 136 episodes later. I think my channel's a lot more refined, and I think the production value that I'm bringing is a lot better, but it's been really fun. So it's cool to come back to it. I feel like I have a different approach for today. A lot of times, actually, I would say 95% of the time, I focus on producers and the tracks that they've produced. Danny Howells is a producer, and even though he's got a long list of remixes going all the way back to 1997 and original productions starting in 2003. He's not just a producer. I think he's actually more known and more famous for his DJ sets. Danny is a producer that still stands out as a producer that has the right sensibilities and the almost the empathy that a DJ needs to read a dance floor correctly, read a crowd correctly, understand the venue, the time of day, and take all those factors into consideration when he's playing. One of the other things that I've talked about before with Danny in a few of my episodes, I've discussed him here and there, is his tendency to only play tracks that you would find if you were digging. The inverse of that would be to say that he almost never plays really popular, obvious tracks. So I think for that reason, really purist DJs and dancers and people that are like super into their music appreciate Danny because he metaphorically is shining a flashlight into the darkest corners of places that you can buy vinyl and tracks and bringing tracks that, I mean, you can go on Discogs and find records with 30, 40 owners that are legit 5-star tracks. And for whatever reason, they didn't get the right label, they didn't get the right promotion, they just never caught the wave, and now they just become sort of something that's sort of old and forgotten. And Danny basically is playing those tracks for you. So he has a wonderful presence in the DJ booth, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. He very much interacts with the crowd, and you can tell he just is always having a great time. So every time I've ever seen him on camera, you can just tell he's really enjoying himself in the booth. And I've always thought of Danny as basically a rock star that is disguised as a DJ. I think that's a great way to explain it, and I think he would actually probably laugh at that and maybe agree with it too. So for today's episode, like I said, I am going to talk about some Danny Howells productions here, but it's not just going to be about the productions. I'm also going to talk about his mixed compilations, and I also want to talk about some of the tracks that I learned about and discovered by way of Danny, because I think I think it'll tell the story a little bit better, right? It'll round out the episode. I'm not just going to focus on, oh, he made this record in 03 and this one in 05, although that's going to be in there. It's more of just like the whole impact that Danny Howells has had on me as a DJ, an obsessive listener, and a dancer. And so I had to think about this. I thought about where does my story with Danny Howells begin? And I had to go all the way back to the forums. It might have been Club Planet, sicktracks.com, one of those forums, and I think the year was 2003. Arc was a very popular nightclub up in New York, and it was a minimalist club in the fact that it was just a square with stacks in the corner, a great sound system, a DJ booth, which I think I remember this correctly. I think it had mirrors on the ceiling of the DJ booth so that if you were standing in front of the booth, you could see the reflection of what the DJ was doing. So it was like the ultimate honest, purist DJ or clubbing experience. I think that's the best way to put it. And somebody was mentioning on one of those forums that I talked about, they said Danny Howells played this track called Dust Sucker and blew the room up. So I never heard of anything called Dust Sucker, and I'm like, why the hell would it be called Dust Sucker? So I'm pretty sure I went on to Napster at the time. I think Napster was still running in '03. I think it was still running, and I uncovered it. So it was actually this record here. This is DJ Remy's Bang EP, which did release in 2003. And the reason that this track is called Dust Sucker is because it has basically the sound of a vacuum spooling up, or maybe a jet engine. It might actually be a jet engine sample, but a vacuum. And tracks from I would say the early 2000s tend to have more personality than tracks now, especially with techno. This is definitely a techno record. And you can really, this is a great example of a track having a lot of distinct personality. If I heard this now, I would only need to hear maybe 10 or 15 seconds of the intro, the kind of like little catchy, stabby, plinky plonk intro, and then into the pumping, pounding bass line. I mean, this is an absolutely crazy record. And I've been waiting for years and years to find a way to either play this out or show it to somebody else or talk about it, because I always felt like it was such an underappreciated record. I'm going to give you guys a sample of it here. This is DJ Remy's Dust Sucker, and brought to you by Danny Howells initially. The Dust Sucker track got me at least looking for other posts about Danny Howells, because I was so fired up after having discovered such a bomb. Back in those days, I was very, I was in my early 20s, very energetic on the dance floor, a lot more than now. I didn't have any bodily injuries and bad knees or an aching back, so I went ham on the dance floor. So anything along those lines was great for me. And one of the things, as I started paying more attention to Danny Howells' posts and post-party threads and topics, was I noticed that people were talking a lot about Danny's special edits. Danny was initially, like I said, if you look at his vinyl discography, it goes back to '97. He's primarily was a remixer in the beginning. And a lot of his remixes didn't see the light of day, or you had to go and see him at his residency at ARC to really capture or hear some of these tracks. They were his exclusives. One of those exclusives that I just picked up recently is this here. This is Inxs's remix by Danny of Need You Tonight. Now this is a great example. This is definitely a bootleg. There's nobody taking ownership of this. I'm sure the sample wasn't cleared or wasn't clearable, but it does show that basically, like I said, Danny Howells was a rock star. Here he is taking a classic rock track with a really catchy riff. The guitar riff in Need You Tonight is undeniable, and making it into a progressive track. I'm not going to give you a sample here because the mastering on this is a little bit muddy and my copy is not perfect, so I'm not going to slow down the episode with it too much, but check this one out too. And another 03, 04-ish bootleg that Danny Howells did, I think also shows off his more eclectic side. This here is Underworld's Dark and Long, remixed by Danny. And the original track is one of Underworld's most popular songs, probably along with Born Slippy. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with the Dark Train mix. That's a little bit more of a straightforward progressive mix. And Danny Howells shows off his eclectic side. with a breakbeat rendition of Dark and Long. It's not the most complicated remix ever, but it does fit into Danny's style, which is to have many styles. He even going back in the day, if you had to talk about, well, what's Danny gonna play, you don't know what he's going to play because he had the ability to move through multiple genres in a set, and he basically did that habitually. That's something that the older generation of DJs did that I don't see too many modern DJs doing. The modern DJs are very much confined to a specific sound, and especially with shorter set durations, it's just gotten like really it's gotten so far away from where it used to be. One of the things that I would say about Danny is that he always had a sense for the ability to build a set, to start at point A and go to point B, and that's something that I've taken along with me in my DJing career. I always try to build my sets up. I always try to start with a lower BPM than I end with, and I think that creates just an overall better experience for the dancers. It gives them a chance to ramp up. Now I mentioned that Underworld Dark and Long track has a breakbeat, and that also shows another aspect of Danny Howells, which is, like I said, his willingness to play multiple genres in a current night. So you could end up at trance, but maybe before you got to trance, you started out with down tempo listening to him, or you down tempo into breaks and then into low speed house, and then from house into maybe 125, 127 progressive house, and then maybe some 130 techno, and then some 135 trance, right? That would be the type of progression that you could possibly hear if you heard Danny Howells play a long enough set, at least back in the day. So props to him for that. I always love that, and that's something that I still aspire to as a DJ. Also in 2003, Danny Howells released a powerful compilation on the Global Underground series. Back in the day, Global Underground was basically the premier stop for anything involving progressive house, and they are still much loved amongst progressive house fans that are probably in their 40s to maybe about 50 years old. I would say anybody in that age range, especially dudes that used to DJ, love all that old classic progressive house. It was really fun to mix. You could play long sets with it, and you could really create some dark environments with it. Danny Howells, like I said, always had a regard for the dance floor and that dance floor empathy that you need to keep you out of the zone of being the DJ that just cluelessly bangs it out at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Here's Danny showing off his versatility with a two disc series. And what I want to point out, first of all, my CD here is absolutely war torn. This was sitting in the car for years and years, and it's really sun faded. But the discs inside are actually in really good shape. But I wanted to point out, if you look at the track listing here, you can see there's a day disc and a night disc, and that it's not to say that Danny is the only progressive house producer to do a day and night or a morning and evening concept, but it does show, like I said, that empathy. The entire first disc is just down tempo, and then in the second disc it goes more into progressive house and ends with some techno. So like I said, that classic Danny Howells progression. The track that I want to showcase for you here, I think, is actually really reflective of the entire first disc, and it's the first track. It's called Honeyroot Starshine. Starshine has a lot in common with the other tracks on here. There's almost an underlying sonic theme to all of disc 1, and to me it sounds like there's one element it's almost like a commonality that a lot of the tracks, almost all of them, share. It's like a wet sounding percussion plop or snap. And you'll hear it in the Honeyroot track. You can hear it in the Telephone Tel Aviv track that features on track 8 on the disc a little bit later. I'm sorry, track 9. But there's something about that that's like almost like a signature Danny Howells sonic element for me. And I think it really captures also possibly the golden era, like the ultimate golden era of down-tempo music. If you think back to the era of Nightmares on Wax up until about 2003 with albums like Smoker's Delight, it's the same theme. It's almost like the sweet spot of down-tempo music where the choices for the elements, there weren't too many. It wasn't too easy to get into production, so you only had people making music that were actually musically inclined and talented. And because of that, it just created this like sweet spot where things weren't too complicated, there weren't too many choices. So there is some overall similarity between most down-tempo and trip-hop tracks of the era, but like I said, it's stuff that has still really aged well. To give kind of an analogy to that, I would say that it's kind of like for video gamers. If you think of the original Nintendo, it's kind of raw. The controller was a little bit too primitive. But when the Super Nintendo came out, they added more buttons. The games didn't get so complicated like they did in Nintendo 64 and later versions. It was more of like the sweet spot of simplicity and fun. I think that's really also reflected in that era's down-tempo. So a lot of magic happening, I would say, from 2000 to 2003 specifically. Now, moving up to 2005, Danny released another Global Underground release. This one was Global Underground number 27, Miami. And again, I apologize for how bad this looks, but any CDs I buy, they go into my car, and God help them after that. They just get absolutely blasted in there. But this, you can see Danny's got his like rock star shirt on. I love the shirt, Danny. This is that's one of the best shirts I've ever seen. I'm rocking it for the cover. This is, I would say, even regarded more highly amongst Danny Howells fans than the previous 24/7 mix and compilation. This is probably a little bit houseier, and I absolutely love it for that. The track that I want to feature for you on here is the first one, and it's Subway's Thermal. And before I start talking about Subway Thermal, I want to say that one of the things I've noticed from following Danny Howells for years and years is that the first track that he plays in any set is one that you need to pay attention to and probably go out and buy. I think he puts a lot of thought into what he plays first. It's almost always something that's really significant, timeless, and something that you would want to own. So if you want to curate a bunch of gems, just download Danny sets and just figure out the first song that he played, especially if he had time to prepare and think about it. I think you're going to find that it's almost always a winner. And going in line with that, Subway Thermal, it's like, Danny, where did you find this? I remember back in the day trying to follow Danny Howells set lists and playlists and being glued to the internet when anybody would talk about tracks that Danny played, or if Danny would do an interview and talk about records that he really liked. And I was always amazed at how obscure everything was that Danny found. It's like, where did he get that? There's no chance of me finding it. So Discogs was around, but Discogs was really raw back then. So you were shopping on Gem and Music Stack and eBay and all these dancerecords.com, all these sketch websites, and you could find the tracks, but you had to put your work in, and you also had to be willing to wait 2, 3, 4 years to sometimes even find one to come up for sale. The marketplace just wasn't that easy, and because of that, I think people, and maybe myself included, I think we appreciated the effort. We appreciated the music more because it was harder to get, right? Everything's like almost instantaneous now. With downloads, forget about it. There's absolutely no challenge other than possible monetary challenges, but it's just there's no secrets anymore. So Subway Thermal is a great secret that Danny shared with the world. And one of the aspects that I like about Thermal, and I found to be another common theme listening to Danny Howells tracks, if you listen to a Danny Howells house segment of a set where he's playing just house, there's a swing and a sway factor to the music. And it took me a while to figure out how he managed to do that, and it's with his track selection. So you can play tracks that have something that hits in between every kick, which gives it a very energetic sort of like pumping rhythm, or you can have tracks that have their main percussion elements hitting on the 2 and the 4 kicks. So maybe that would be a big hand clap. You'll hear on the 2 and 4 in the Subway Thermal track that there is a percussion element hitting, and that is what gives Danny Howells the secret kind of swing sway factor that I think a lot of other DJs aspire to, but maybe miss because I don't think they know what that secret ingredient is. But Subway Thermal is a great example of the Danny Howells vibe. If you just listen to the big sweeping synths in there and how bright and energetic yet laid back and eclectic that track is, I mean, that's just pure magic. That's Howells all the way. Now here's where Danny really started to go full tilt into my world. In 2007, Danny did an essential mix with Pete Tong narrating over it. I didn't know about it. My friends were much more up on the essential mixes at the time. I remember it was a Saturday morning. My friends had been out at a rave the night before. I didn't go for some reason. I think I had to work the next morning. But they invited me to come over at like 10 a.m. the next day. So they were still going from the night before. No one had gone to sleep. So I showed up into this like chaotic yet very fun environment and was just hanging out with everybody. And they had the Danny Howells Essential Mix from 2007 playing in the background. And I remember one of the guys remarking about a third of the way into the mix that he couldn't tell when Danny was blending one track into the other. And that's another aspect of Danny that I've always enjoyed, is the sensitivity to his blends, the long blending. There's almost nothing happening as far as effects or cutting the bass, or there's nothing abrupt, right? Everything's very subtle and smooth, and it really creates this like gentle morphing experience when you're listening to tracks or a set from him, and you can't really tell, especially if it's a first time and you don't own any of the music that's being played, you can't really tell when the track changed. And especially with a pre-designed mix like the Essential Mix, which I'm sure he didn't, I'm like 99% confident that that was not recorded like in a live session, right? That was built with computer software. It's just way too intricate for that. But if you really have time to sit there and EQ and manipulate songs and shift them, like, oh, I want this to happen 32 beats sooner, you can get really, really wild with blends. And I think in the context of house and progressive house, just create, like I said, these ever morphing shifts where it's like, I don't even know what's happening. There might be 3 tracks playing. It's just a mind-blowing experience. And Danny Howell's Essential Mix from 2007 is one of my favorites ever. I probably listened to it like 200 times at this point without exaggerating. It's just a perfect mix. Early on in that mix, getting into Danny Howell's production skills, he features his own remix of Quentin Harris's House. And it's actually labeled as the Danny Howell's re-edit. I don't know what its relationship is to the original mix of House. I never really listened to it, but this is one key point in the 2007 Essential Mix where you can hear Danny Howell's production skills coming in, and there's just something about the low, slow, methodical thump of the kick drum. I think right as this track starts to introduce is when Pete Tong starts talking, and you can just hear it just pounding in the background. It's a big kick drum, and later on this track goes on to like really intense melodic crescendos, which Danny's very good with his melodics, and it's really just a gem. Now, a few tracks later is one of the most important tracks that Danny Howells ever taught me about by way of his mixes. And it's this here. It is Little Bigby's Scuba EP. I talked about this previously on episode 22 in my House Weapons episode. I try not to really ever repeat music ever for you guys, but I want to keep the dopamine flowing, and I try not to to basically hit you with the same track twice, or like repeat the same thoughts too many times, because I want it to always be new. But this track really needs to be talked about more than once, because it's just such a magical house record. In the context of the 2007 Essential Mix, this comes in maybe track 8 or track 9, and it absolutely blows the roof off. The track that it segues out of is one that's on Ibadan. And when I first heard this was another example of me not being able to tell when the track was changing, because the layering that Danny did when he developed the mix was just so deep. But this is one of the most wonderful house and progressive house, and with a little bit of touch of jazz elements mixed in. It's so unique. And the other thing that's interesting about it is that it's released on a Japanese label that back in the day, when in 2007, this label was extremely obscure. This is Flower Records, which is the main production outlet for Little Bigby. The remix that everybody's concerned with here, and that like most hardcore Danny Howells fans will know, is the Jazztronic remix of KGO here. The track on the flip side of this, Scuba, is actually really good down tempo too. But so sorry, I was off on a tangent there. Flower Records was really absolutely insane and impossible to get. So if you were listening to this mix back in the day and you said, "Oh, I'm going to go buy the vinyl," no, you weren't. You were not going to buy it anywhere unless you were willing to fly over to Japan and start record hunting in their stores. Because I went to probably page 8 or 10 of the Google search, exhausting all English-speaking websites to find that record out of stock, and then maybe I would see it on some Japanese site, and I don't even think it was in stock there, but I would be trying to contact people that were running the music shops, and they would reply back in Japanese or in broken English, and it was literally an ungettable record. It wasn't until Discogs started to get more traction in 2009 that 2010, I think, that I actually picked up a copy of it finally. After years of searching for it, maybe like once a month I would go through and just see if it popped up in stock anywhere. I had eBay alerts. So it was an amazing track. It was hard to get, and because of those two things combining, it became an obsession of mine. Because I work so hard to get it, when I do play house sets out now, I still take that vinyl with me and I play it, and somebody always says something about it. It's just pure magic. And later on in the 2007 Essential Mix, towards the end, like I said, you never know what Danny's going to do, and especially towards the end of a set, be ready for a curveball. At the end of that set, Danny drops this, which is by Tom York. This is Harrow Downhill. Tom York, as many of you know, is the lead singer of Radiohead, and here this was a solo project that he did. It's a really wonky beat. I clocked it on my phone with my BPM counter, and it's about 125 beats per minute. But it's a very electronic sounding. If you listen to it, and when obviously it's electronic, but if you just listen to the kicks and the way that it's arranged, it very much has the aesthetic of being produced on a computer. And I think what the genius is that, first of all, Danny discovered it because the beat's a little bit weird. He had to get weird about how he brought it into the mix. So I believe the intro was looped a little bit to refine it and allow it to seamlessly work into the track that was coming before it. The lyrics of Harrow Downhill are really dark. There's really dark synths in here too, which I would say accompany almost like the sound of a funeral home. I mean, it's really like some dark, drab Dracula shit. And the lyrics are about I believe it was about a scientist. It's been a few years since I read the Wikipedia, but there's a whole story behind Harrow Downhill. I think it was a scientist that was somehow involved in something to do with the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, or yeah, that Saddam had. And I think he might have been a whistleblower or something along those lines. And because he was a whistleblower, he ended up committing suicide, according to the Wikipedia article, but all of the circumstantial evidence makes it look like he actually was murdered or poisoned in some way. So really dark story. If you listen to, or I'm sorry, if you go and read that Wikipedia, like I think you'll really get sucked into it, and it'll add another aspect to that record that you may not have known about before that. And the funny thing is, in completely wild Danny Howells fashion, Danny Howells on many occasions has talked about his love for James Brown. Danny goes right into James Brown, "Do It on the Good Foot" out of Harrow Downhill. So I guess he didn't want to end on a somber note. He ended the set on a completely uplifting note. But it was really wild to see Danny play the last two tracks of a set, have one be a completely morbid track, and then finish with a James Brown record. But props to you there, Danny. In 2008, Danny Howells released his Renaissance CD, which is much loved by his fans. It was a double CD, and it mostly focused around modern tech house and softer house with, I would say, some eclectic techno featured in there. People love it. I remember it was one of the first albums that I ever experimented with buying on iTunes. I had the CD too, but I can't find it. I think somebody might have stolen it out of my car, unfortunately. But it was another great way to learn about new music, and it also showcased some of Danny's tracks that he was releasing on his new Dig Deeper label, which launched in 2009. Before I go on to dig deeper, though, I do want to share a really nice track that I learned about from the mix. And I thought it was cool that Danny snuck this in because if you listen to the mix, you wouldn't get the sense that anything that was played in that mix is old, but that's not the case. Sometimes old tracks sound new because they're so timeless or ahead of their times. And Danny snuck in this little gem. This is Azimuth, and it's Jazz Carnival, Global Communications Space Jazz Remix. This is an 11-minute house anthem all the way back from 1996 that Danny just like kind of sprinkled in there into his Renaissance mix in disc 1. And I just absolutely love it. Global Communications at the time, I think, or still had Tom Middleton in it. Tom Middleton has appeared in many Danny House sets as a remixer and producer. And a great track here, and this was also reissued just recently. So if you like this sample and you want to go and get it, maybe you don't even have to worry about getting an old scratched up copy. You can grab the repress. I mentioned Dig Deeper, Danny Howell's label in 2009. First release on there is great. I'm not going to give you a sample because I want to keep things moving here, but I do love this record. It's Danny Howell's September. Very eclectic track. When I first listened to it, I thought it was 10 minutes, but it's actually 13 minutes and 30 seconds. So it's just a really long, chill out, just sit on the couch, sun coming through the windows adventure. I really love it for that, and I love the courage that Danny had to put something out like this, especially as the first track on what would end up becoming a really great label of his. Next is another track from Dig Deeper that I think fully encapsulates the entire label's sound. This is basically the era of Dig Deeper and peak Danny Howells to me, all in one sound here. This is his Shining release. I missed this initially when it came in stock at Juno. I don't think I had any money in my bank account. It went out of stock and it never came back. It took me just until the past 6 months for some US seller on Discogs to list this for $10, and I was finally able to get it. But this is featured on the Renaissance CD. And like I said, if you just listen to the lead synth in here, I'll give you a sample. This is signature Danny Howells. This is the big sweeping sound that he's known for. So Dig Deeper wrapped up in 2013, but Danny didn't rest. Right back to it with another double CD on Balance. This is the one that I featured all the way back in episode 1, so I'm not going to talk too much about the mix, but this is definitely a showcase of Danny Howell's ability to pick out tracks that nobody knows but that are wonderful and string them all together in a very sensible manner. Awesome mix there. One that you definitely need to sit and listen to 2 or 3 times and just soak it in. You don't want to be interrupted while you're listening to it. It's a journey, and it's a gentle one too. My takeaway track from that is this relatively obscure and underappreciated one. This is Robot Needs Oil, and it is remixed by Simon Garcia. Simon Garcia is a producer that's very talented. I've seen his tracks and remixes appear several times on Danny Howell's mixes or live sets, and unfortunately Simon Garcia's tracks aren't always put to wax. So more often than not, they're actually just digital only. In this case, you can get a little taste of his magic here. This also has, when I was talking about earlier on, that Danny Howell's secret sauce, the percussion on the 2 and the 4, you can hear it here. And I think I would like to talk to Danny and just ask him, like, did you ever notice that you go for those types of tracks? Because I'm wondering if he's actually aware of it, or if it's just a subconscious taste that he has for a certain type of vibe in music that he's trying to create. But Robot Needs Oil here, nice affordable tech house track that is very much reflective of the Danny Howell's Balance 24. And to close out this long journey, my last single that I want to present to you is from an EP that Danny did in 2019. This is on 8-bit. Danny's last 3 EPs, the most recent 3 that he's done have been on 8-bit. And it's a good outlet for him. They have nice cover art. The pressings are reliable and high quality. And it's a good place to find really nice functional tech house. Here, the sleeper track, my favorite, is Danny's Retreat here. I absolutely love the strings and the violins in Retreat. It is a wonderful symphonic journey to listen to. I am curious to know if that came from a piece of classical music of some sort. There's something about it that just reminds me of maybe like the way Carl Craig or Theo Parrish would take an old symphonic loop and make something really creative out of it. Is that what happened here with Retreat too? I don't know. This is definitely right in the wheelhouse of a Danny Howells production. That soft, gentle afternoon vibe, I think, is what he's known best for in his production space.
Yeah.
Everybody, thank you for listening. I know this has been a long episode. I hope you really enjoyed it. Danny Howells, thank you so much for all the music over the years. You've influenced me immensely. I can't wait to see you again. I hope I get to run into you again in person. Before I go, I just want to say the time that I got to meet you at 2013 in the Panther room at Output, that was pretty much a life-changing moment for me. I was completely starstruck when I got to talk to you. I had been drinking before that, so I wasn't in the best shape. And when I introduced myself to you and you recognized me from my Discogs picture and said, "Mark, didn't you write a really nice review for me on Discogs?" That pretty much blew my mind at that point, and I still haven't gotten over it. So thank you so much. I'll give you guys a picture here of the right after that. Danny and I were able to get a selfie together, and a wonderful, wonderful night commenced after that. So thank you so much, Danny. Take care.